The dog bolted into the road like a shot from a cannon, its eyes wide with terror and its ribs heaving beneath matted fur, just as Margaret Larson slammed both feet on the brake pedal and screamed louder than she had in 20 years. The old Ford groaned under the sudden halt, skidding across the gravel shoulder with a sound that tore through the quiet afternoon like a razor, while the dog stood frozen in the middle of the lane, one paw lifted in pain, too exhausted to run, too proud to collapse. Margaret sat trembling behind the wheel, heart pounding so fiercely she thought her ribs might crack from the inside, her eyes locked on the animal like it was some ghost from a war she'd buried long ago and promised herself never to revisit. When the dust finally settled around them, and the trembling stopped just enough for her hands to function again, she opened the door slowly, as though any sudden movement might shatter the fragile silence that had descended like mist over that lonely stretch of county road. The shepherd didn't growl, didn't whimper, didn't move, just stared at her with eyes that held something far more human than any animal had the right to carry, something wounded, wary, and filled with a kind of betrayal she recognized instantly, because she'd seen it once in a hospital bed when a soldier bled out while whispering someone else's name. Her voice cracked when she spoke, not from fear, but from something older and colder, something that had lived inside her since the funeral and never found its way out. "What the hell happened to you, boy?" The dog stepped back once, staggered, then collapsed, not with a thud, but a soft surrender, like a house folding in on itself after the fire's gone out and nothing's left but ash and splinters. The silence after was worse than any scream, and when she knelt beside him and laid her hand gently on his neck, she felt the tremor running through his bones and knew, without needing to see blood or bruises, that someone had tried to break this animal and almost succeeded. She wrapped him in the blanket from the back seat, whispering nonsense the way she once did for her husband after the stroke, words with no meaning but full of warmth, and as she carried the dog to her car, her spine aching under the weight of more than just the animal, she knew bringing him home wasn't a decision, it was a duty. Back at the house, with the storm clouds gathering low and slow like regret, she laid him on the rug by the fireplace, lit the kindling with trembling hands, and watched his chest rise and fall in ragged rhythm, as though each breath had to fight its way out of a place he didn't want to be. When the thunder finally cracked above the roof and the windows rattled like old bones, the dog opened his eyes, met hers again, and for just one moment, she saw something flicker there, recognition, maybe, or memory, or the shape of a name that neither of them could say aloud just yet. By morning, she had bathed him, fed him, and dressed the wound she found near his hind leg, though something about the shape of the scar made her stomach knot, like it had been done deliberately, almost surgically, and definitely not by another animal. She made a note to call the vet, but deep down she already knew this wasn't just a stray, this dog had a story, and that story wasn't over, not yet, not by a long shot. In the days that followed, he began to walk again, limping with slow, measured steps that betrayed both pain and caution, always pausing near doors and windows, as if watching for someone, or perhaps fearing that someone might return. Margaret noticed the way he tensed every time the landline rang, how he stood between her and the door when the mail arrived, and how he refused to enter the spare bedroom where her son once slept, even though she never once let him there. The real change came a week later, when she left the back gate open by mistake and returned from town to find the dog gone, no paw prints, no note, no goodbye, just silence. She searched the neighborhood for hours, calling out the name she hadn't even given him yet, until her throat was raw and her legs begged her to stop, and it wasn't until dusk fell that she found him again, sitting perfectly still outside a house 4 blocks away, a house she hadn't visited in nearly 5 years. It was her son's house. The same house he'd moved into with Claire, the woman Margaret had once dared to call daughter, before betrayal, inheritance, and silence pulled them all apart like teeth from a jaw. The dog just sat there, eyes fixed on the door, tail unmoving, his whole body tense like a coiled spring, until Margaret whispered, "Why here?" He turned and looked at her, not with confusion or apology, but with something closer to confirmation. And then she saw it. On the porch, half hidden beneath a planter, was something she hadn't expected, a woman's shoe, torn at the heel, smeared with what looked like dried blood. Her voice barely rose above the wind, but it carried all the weight of the years between them. "Who did this to you?" "It was her," came a voice behind her, gravel-thick and breathless, making Margaret spin around so fast her knees nearly gave out beneath her. A man stood near the fence, hidden half in shadow, with a face weathered by time and guilt, eyes like storm clouds barely holding back the rain, and hands that trembled not from age, but from memory. She screamed once, he said again, softer this time, as if the words themselves burned his tongue, and the dog wouldn't stop barking, not even after it was over. Margaret stared at him, heart hammering like it did during the sirens in Kandahar, the world around her narrowing to a tunnel of cold wind and rising nausea, because this wasn't just some neighbor, this was Richard Coulter, her son's former landlord, the same man who disappeared right after Claire stopped answering phone calls. "You saw something," she said, voice tight, like stretched wire ready to snap, and the dog, still silent beside her, growled so low it felt like the earth itself was rumbling beneath their feet. "I saw everything," he whispered, and with those words the air seemed to change, as if the world had tilted and no one else noticed, only them. He motioned for her to follow him behind the house, down a narrow alley choked by overgrown hedges and broken dreams, toward a rusted gate that creaked open like a confession. They stopped in front of a shed, old, padlocked, covered in mildew and silence, and Margaret's stomach turned when the dog's entire body went rigid, his nose raised toward the wood like it carried a memory soaked into every board. "She used to come here," Coulter murmured, pointing to the shed, "when things got bad inside, when the yelling started and the bruises got harder to hide." Margaret didn't want to believe it, didn't want to picture her son's voice raised in fury, didn't want to imagine Claire afraid in the cold, but the truth had already begun to scrape its way through the cracks of everything she had tried to hold together with silence. Coulter fumbled in his pocket, pulled out a rusted key, and handed it to her without another word, as if he no longer trusted his own mouth to say the things his soul had carried too long. With the dog pressed tight against her side, she turned the key slowly, feeling each groove slide into place like unlocking a past she had buried beneath years of blame and pretending. The door groaned open, and inside, amid the rotting tarps and rusted tools, lay a small, frayed scarf, the one she had given Claire for Christmas 5 years ago, embroidered with tiny blue flowers and a single tear-shaped stain that had never come out, no matter how many times Claire tried to wash it. The dog stepped forward first, nosing the scarf gently, then looking up at Margaret with eyes that carried 1,000 unspoken truths and one burning question: how much more are you willing to see? She lifted the scarf with hands that didn't feel like her own, fingers shaking so violently the fabric trembled like a leaf in winter, and when she turned to Coulter, he couldn't meet her eyes anymore. "I heard him that night," he said, voice rough like gravel under boots, heard him scream at her to shut up, heard her cry, then nothing. Margaret's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, the air felt too thick to move through, her ears ringing with a memory she didn't have but now owned completely. She stared at the man who had watched and waited and done nothing, then at the shed where Claire had hidden, and finally at the dog who had refused to leave the place where she had last been seen. And just when the silence felt unbearable, just when she thought she might collapse beneath the weight of it all, Coulter whispered something that turned her blood cold. She tried to run, but your son, he dragged her back. Her legs gave out, and she sank to the ground, the scarf pressed against her chest like it could protect her from the avalanche of realization crashing through her ribs. The dog leaned into her side, silent still, like a soldier standing guard over the wounded, eyes fixed on the man who finally began to cry. And somewhere behind all the grief and fury and the image of Claire's face blinking through the dark, a new question rose like smoke from a house that had just started to burn. If he did that to her, what else is he hiding? "He's hiding a body," Coulter said, his voice barely louder than the wind, but sharp enough to slice through Margaret like a blade through linen. The words hit her so hard she couldn't breathe at first, like someone had punched her soul and left her gasping for a truth she never asked to find. She rose to her feet slowly, knees crackling under the weight of age and grief, her eyes locked on Coulter like she wasn't sure whether to thank him or strike him down. "I don't know who it was," he continued, staring down at the dirt like it had secrets carved in its skin, "but it wasn't just Claire he hurt, that I know for sure." The German shepherd stood motionless beside her, his body still as stone, his ears flicked forward, his breath shallow, like he too understood the storm now gathering beneath their feet. Coulter motioned toward the edge of the property, toward a grove of old birch trees where the grass grew thicker and the ground stayed damp no matter how long the sun beat down. "I saw him there one night," he said, shovel in one hand, garbage bag in the other, like it was just another chore to check off a list. Margaret followed his gaze, her breath tight, her fists clenched, because deep down, beneath the ache and the disbelief and the memory of lullabies she used to hum to the boy who once needed her, she knew this wasn't madness, it was memory finally pulling back the curtain. They moved together in silence, through the thorns and the overgrowth, the dog leading now, not with fear but with purpose, as if something in his blood demanded that he show her every last corner of the story he could never speak. When they reached the trees, the dog stopped suddenly, his head bowed, his paws pressing lightly against one patch of uneven ground where the grass had grown just a little too high, too fast. Coulter handed her a rusted garden spade, the kind used more for turning soil than uncovering sins, and said nothing more, the silence between them louder than any prayer. She dug with slow, deliberate motions, each clump of earth another nail in the coffin of the image she once had of her son, the boy who used to bring her wildflowers and draw superheroes with his pancakes. After only a few inches, the metal hit something hard, not bone, not stone, but plastic, thick and black and tied with twine that had frayed with age and rain. The dog began to whimper then, not out of fear, but recognition, the kind that lives in nightmares and memories that never left his blood. She didn't speak as she peeled back the layers, revealing what appeared to be a small duffel bag, waterlogged and stained, and when she finally unzipped it, what she found wasn't a body, not yet, but something that stole the breath from her lungs all the same. Photographs. Dozens of them. Claire, bruised and broken in some, others of the dog chained to a post, others still of people Margaret didn't recognize, women, mostly, all with eyes that didn't know how to lie but had clearly tried to survive something terrible. And at the very bottom, wrapped in a faded red scarf, was Claire's phone, the same one her son claimed she lost weeks before she vanished. Margaret sank to the ground beside the bag, the phone still warm from the earth, and in that moment, she knew this was no longer about blame or disbelief, this was about truth, and it had teeth. Coulter dropped beside her, voice hoarse with something that sounded like shame. "I didn't say anything because I didn't want to believe it either," he whispered, "but I kept that bag buried, hoping someday someone would need it." She looked at him then, eyes hollow but clear, and said the words she never thought she'd speak about her own flesh and blood. "He's dangerous." Coulter nodded once, slow and tired, and then something flickered behind him, headlights, sweeping across the trees like a lighthouse scanning for the wreckage it knows is out there. A truck pulled into the driveway next door, her son's truck. She grabbed the bag, heart slamming like artillery, and turned to the man who had waited too long to speak. "If I go to the police, will they protect me?" "No," Coulter said sharply, grabbing her wrist just as she turned toward the road, his eyes wide with a kind of fear that came from knowing too much for too long. "If you go now, with just this bag and a story soaked in emotion, they'll ask questions you can't answer and label you a grieving mother with a vendetta," he continued, his grip trembling, "and your son will smell the fear and burn the evidence before morning." Margaret wanted to scream, to run into the police station and throw the duffel on the desk, demand justice like it was something the world still owed people like Claire, like herself, like the dog who stood ready to protect her even as danger crept back into their lives. Instead, she crouched beside the German shepherd, who hadn't taken his eyes off the road since the headlights first appeared, his ears pinned back and body taut like a soldier waiting for orders. The truck's engine cut off, and for a moment, the world held its breath. Not a bird chirped, not a leaf stirred, until the driver's door slammed shut with a force that made Margaret flinch and the dog growl low and deep in his throat. Footsteps crunched across the gravel, slow and deliberate, the kind of steps a man takes when he owns the land he's walking on, or thinks he does. "I know someone at the station," Coulter whispered quickly, guiding her back behind the shed, his voice barely audible over the rising wind, "someone who owed Claire a favor, someone who was looking into her disappearance before the case got buried under budget cuts and silence." Margaret didn't respond, couldn't, her throat had closed up, her knees buckled again, and she had to lean against the wall of the shed just to stay upright, because nothing in her body trusted the ground anymore. Her son's voice rang out across the yard, sharp and casual like he was tossing stones into a pond. "Mom. You around?" Truck was open, thought I'd stop in, see if you're still alive. The cruelty of those words landed harder than any fist could have, and for one horrifying second, she thought about stepping out and pretending everything was fine, the way she'd done for years, with every birthday she spent alone, every letter he never answered. But then the dog growled again, louder this time, his hackles raised and teeth bared not from fear, but from something older and purer, loyalty forged in pain. Coulter pointed toward the woods behind the yard, the long trail that snaked behind 3 more houses and led to the outskirts of town, where the police station's lights could just barely be seen through the trees. You run now, he said, pressing the bag against her chest, but you don't go through the front door, you go around the back, ask for Officer Jenkins, tell her what I told you, show her what's in the bag. Margaret nodded once, her lips pressed together so tight they turned white, and then she turned to the dog and whispered, "Go with him," but the dog didn't move, he stayed at her side, body pressed to her leg, gaze fixed on the sound of her son's voice now echoing closer. Coulter slipped away into the trees, vanishing with the silence of a man used to being forgotten, while Margaret clutched the duffel like it was the last piece of someone who still needed saving. And then, as her son's shadow stretched across the lawn, a new noise shattered the stillness, a phone, ringing inside the bag. The sound was jarring, too loud, too real, and she fumbled with the zipper, yanking the phone free and staring at the caller ID with disbelief. It was Claire's number. The blood drained from her face as she answered with trembling fingers, her voice breaking apart like wet wood under pressure. "Hello." There was silence first, then a breath, then a voice she hadn't heard in over a year, a voice she had grieved, cursed, and prayed for all in the same day. "Margaret," Claire whispered, "they told me you were dead." "Claire." Margaret's voice cracked like a fault line splitting open, disbelief pouring through her bones faster than her mind could catch up with. The German shepherd leaned into her leg as if he could feel her blood draining, his eyes locked on the house where her son was now calling her name again, louder, sharper, angrier. "I'm alive," Claire whispered, and just those 2 words held more weight than all the silence, lies, and funerals Margaret had ever endured in her 71 years on this earth. Tears sprang to her eyes, not the soft kind, but the kind that scraped their way up from the gut, where grief had hardened into stone long ago. "Where are you?" she managed to ask, gripping the phone like it might vanish, like Claire's voice might dissolve if the wind blew too hard. "I can't stay on long," Claire said quickly, voice tight and shaking. "They let me call you once, but I'm in a safe house now, under a different name. They didn't know if they could trust you." Margaret pressed her free hand to her mouth, trying to contain the sob that rose up like a hurricane, not because she felt betrayed, but because now she finally understood what had been buried all along. "You were never missing," she whispered, more to herself than anyone, her mind sprinting through every memory like pages flipping in a storm. "You were hiding." Claire hesitated, then said something that sounded like an apology dressed in agony. "Your son tried to kill me." The words didn't land gently, they arrived like gunfire in a chapel, echoing through every corner of her body, tearing through what little remained of the version of her child she had tried so hard to believe in. "He kept me locked in the basement for 3 days, Claire continued, her voice flat now, like someone who had told the story too many times already and still couldn't escape the echoes, "and when he thought I was dead, he left me in a drainage ditch 2 counties over, but the dog found help before the cold could finish me off." Margaret sank to the ground, the duffel still clutched in her lap, the dog immediately circling her like a sentinel who'd never once left his post. "I didn't know," she whispered, shaking her head, not in denial, but in horror at her own blindness. "I thought he was just lost, angry, selfish. I never imagined he could be that cruel." Claire paused again, and then said the thing Margaret would remember for the rest of her life. "He's done it before." The phone buzzed faintly in her hand, a warning of a dying battery or maybe just the end of whatever protection the safe house had allowed. "There were 2 other women before me," Claire said, her voice now a hollow shell. "One disappeared completely, no body, no trace. The other came forward but was paid off and silenced." Margaret's hand tightened around the phone until her knuckles went white, the wind rising around her like judgment, and the dog pressed closer, as though trying to hold her body together with nothing but presence. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Margaret asked, tears now falling freely, guilt seeping into every word like rain soaking through rotted wood. Because you defended him, Claire said softly, no bitterness, just truth, and I thought if I died, you'd never have to know what he really was. The phone clicked then, one long tone, then silence, and Margaret sat there in the dark, beneath the trees, as her son called out her name one final time, but this time not with charm or manipulation, but with menace. She stood, slowly, like someone learning to walk again after years of being lied to, and she knew now that she didn't need to run anymore, she needed to act. She walked straight across the lawn, her spine stiff, the duffel in one hand, the dog at her side, toward the house she helped pay for and the son who now lived in it like a king built on bones. He stepped out onto the porch, his face twisting from surprise to fury when he saw her approach, but she didn't stop, didn't blink, didn't hesitate for a single breath. And as she passed him without a word, heading straight for his office where the safe was hidden behind a bookshelf, she finally understood what she had to do, not just for Claire, or the dog, or herself, but for every woman who had cried in silence and every mother who had swallowed a lie because it was easier than facing the truth. She opened the safe with shaking hands, as he shouted behind her, demanded answers, barked threats, but she ignored them all, because inside was exactly what she needed: cash, documents, fake IDs, passports, photos, more than enough to put him away for a very long time. And just before she turned to face him, before the shouting became something closer to violence, she said it, calm and clear and final. I know who you are now. You called the cops, he hissed, stepping forward like a man cornered by his own shadow, fury twitching at the corner of his mouth, as if rage alone could still bend the truth back into his favor. Margaret didn't flinch, not even as he closed the distance between them, not even when his voice dropped to that low, venom-laced tone she hadn't heard since the last time he raised it to Claire. They're already here, she said, calm as a winter lake just before the ice breaks, and as if summoned by her certainty, red and blue lights painted the walls of his office through the drawn blinds in slow, unforgiving flashes. Her son froze mid-step, the confident swagger melting away inch by inch until all that remained was the thin, twitching skin of a man who had finally run out of places to hide. Outside, the front door crashed open with the weight of justice long overdue, and uniformed footsteps thundered through the hallway like the sound of every lie coming home to collect. The German shepherd stood between them, growling not with anger but with purpose, as if he had waited his whole life for this single moment of reckoning to arrive. Step back, came Officer Jenkins' voice, sharp and cutting through the tension like a blade through thick cloth, and her presence filled the room with something neither of them had felt in far too long: safety. He raised his hands slowly, but Margaret saw it, that twitch in his fingers, that glint in his eyes, the instinct to lie, to charm, to twist the moment into something manageable. But there would be no twisting left, no more bargains or distractions or tears. She had come too far to flinch now, and the truth no longer lived behind locked doors or buried phones. It was out in the open, breathing free. The officers placed him in cuffs with the precision of people who had been waiting for this moment far longer than they'd ever admit, and as they read him his rights, Margaret let out a breath so deep it seemed to drain 30 years of sorrow from her bones. He looked at her then, one last time, eyes wide with something that might have once been love or hate or maybe just disbelief that she had finally stopped choosing him over the truth. She didn't return the gaze, didn't speak, didn't move. She just laid a hand gently on the shepherd's head and whispered, "Good boy," because he had done what no one else had the courage to do. He had never stopped looking. The sun was rising by the time the cruiser pulled away, the sky bleeding orange and gold like a promise finally being kept, and Margaret stood at the gate with her coat wrapped around her and her heart cracked wide open. Claire arrived 3 days later, walking up the porch steps with hesitant feet and tear-stained eyes, her hair longer now and her voice softer than Margaret remembered, but her arms still fit around her just the same. They didn't speak at first, didn't need to. The silence between them was sacred, not broken but healed, like the quiet between two notes of a song that once only played grief. When Claire finally knelt beside the shepherd and touched his muzzle, the dog leaned into her like a child into its mother, and Margaret watched with tears pooling in her eyes as the last of the unspoken things dissolved in the warmth between them. I thought he'd killed you, Margaret said at last, voice thin and cracked but alive with something like peace, and I almost let him convince me you deserved it. Claire shook her head gently, not in judgment but in grace, and replied, you saved me anyway, even if it took longer than I hoped. They sat on the porch that night, the dog curled between them like a bridge. They had walked together in silence, and Margaret reached into her coat pocket, pulling out the photo Claire had taken with her on the last Christmas they'd all been under the same roof. I still don't know how to forgive him, she whispered, but I think I can start by forgiving myself. Claire took her hand and said nothing, and in that quiet, something lifted from Margaret's chest, a weight she hadn't named but had carried since the day she told her son he could do no wrong. The German shepherd lifted his head then, ears perked as if hearing something far away, and in his eyes was no more pain, no more fear, only rest, only peace, only home. The newspapers would talk about the trial, the arrests, the women who came forward in the weeks that followed, their stories finally believed, their names finally honored, but this story wasn't about courtrooms or headlines. This story was about a woman who stopped running, a survivor who came back from the silence, and a dog who refused to forget. And on that porch, with the stars blooming one by one above them and no ghosts left in the walls, Margaret looked to the sky and whispered, more to herself than anyone. Maybe this is what love really looks like, staying, even when no one believes you. And the dog, ever faithful, closed his eyes and sighed, as if to say, yes. This is home now.